The rain pattered against the windshield of Detective James Rowland's police cruiser as he sipped his lukewarm coffee. It was just after 7 p.m., and the wealthy neighborhood of Pine Hills was quiet except for the occasional car heading home for dinner. Rowlands had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 15 years, and he'd built quite a reputation. Not a good one, though most of his fellow officers either didn't notice or pretended not to. The dashboard computer glowed in the dim light as he scanned the streets. Rowlands wasn't supposed to be patrolling this area tonight, but he'd switched with another officer. He liked keeping an eye on Pine Hills. The rich folks here appreciated his particular brand of keeping the neighborhood safe, which mostly meant stopping anyone who didn't look like they belonged. He straightened up when he spotted a black BMW rolling toward the four-way stop at Maple and Oak. The car slowed down but didn't come to a complete stop before making a right turn. Rowlands narrowed his eyes, watching the driver through the Rain Street window. A woman with dark skin, her hair pulled back neatly, both hands on the wheel. She wore a crisp blazer and seemed focused on the road. Well, Rowlands muttered to himself, flipping on his lights. Let's see what business you have around here. The BMW pulled over right away, signaling properly before coming to a stop under a streetlight. Rowlands called in the license plate and waited for a response before stepping out into the drizzle. Nothing came back on the plates. Clean record. That didn't matter to him. He'd find something. Rowlands took his time walking to the car, hand resting on his holster, a habit he'd developed years ago to make people nervous. He watched as the woman lowered her window. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, with clear eyes that met his without fear. License and registration, he barked, not bothering with a greeting. He shined his flashlight directly into her face, another old trick to assert dominance. Good evening, officer, the woman said calmly, her voice steady despite the harsh light. May I ask why I've been pulled over? Rowlands ignored her question. I said license and registration. Now. He watched as she reached slowly for her purse on the passenger seat, moving deliberately to show she wasn't a threat. Smart woman. But something about her calm demeanor irritated him. Most people got nervous around him. That's how he liked it. Here you go, sir, she said, handing over her documents. My name is Tanya Wilson. Rowlands snatched the paperwork without acknowledging her. The license looked legitimate. Tanya Wilson, 34, Atlanta address in a neighborhood he knew was mostly black professionals. The car was registered in her name. He frowned, tapping the license against his palm as rain dripped from his hat. You know why I stopped you? He finally asked, leaning down to peer into the spotless interior of the car. No, sir, I don't, she replied, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. You ran that stop sign back there, he said, though they both knew she'd merely rolled through it, something half the drivers in this neighborhood did every day without consequences. I'm sorry if it seemed that way, officer. I did stop, though perhaps not for as long as I should have. Rowlands didn't like her tone, too educated, too confident. This woman didn't seem scared of him at all, and that was a problem. He shined his light around the car's interior again, looking for anything he could use. What are you doing in this neighborhood? He demanded. I'm heading to a dinner party at my colleague's house on Pinnacrest Drive, she answered, then added, I'm a lawyer. That made Rowlands' jaw tighten. Lawyers meant trouble, but it also meant he needed to be careful. Or did he? No one had ever successfully filed a complaint against him. He had friends in high places who made sure of that. Step out of the car, please, he ordered suddenly. A flash of something, concern, resignation, perhaps both, crossed Tanya's face, but it was quickly replaced by that same steady calm. She nodded once and reached for her door handle. Little did Detective Rowlands know, this routine traffic stop was about to change everything, not just for him, but for the entire Atlanta Police Department. Tanya Wilson took a deep breath as she reached for her car door handle. The rain was falling harder now, and she knew she'd be soaked within seconds. More concerning was Detective Rowlands' aggressive stance as he stepped back, hands still hovering near his holster. 15 years as a lawyer before joining the FBI had taught her to read people, and everything about this officer screamed danger. Is there a problem, officer? She asked, stepping carefully onto the wet pavement. Her tailored navy suit was about to get ruined, but that was the least of her worries. I'll ask the questions, Rowlands snapped. How long have you owned this vehicle? 3 years, Tanya replied, raindrops running down her face. She discreetly pressed the side button on her watch. A standard FBI issue with recording capabilities. Harvard Law hadn't just taught her about legal rights. It had taught her about evidence. Pretty expensive car for a lawyer, Rollins remarked, walking around the BMW, his flashlight beam scanning the exterior. Where'd you say you work again? I didn't, Tanya said calmly. I work at Baldwin and Associates downtown. This was her cover story, and the firm was actually a front for certain FBI operations. She'd rehearsed this background countless times. Rollins smirked. Stand over there by the guardrail, he ordered, pointing. Hands where I can see them. Tanya complied, the rain now soaking through her blazer. A car drove past, slowing down briefly before speeding up again. No witnesses stopping to help. No surprise there. I'm going to search your vehicle, Rollins announced, already opening the driver's door. Officer, I don't consent to a search, Tanya stated firmly. You pulled me over for allegedly rolling through a stop sign. That doesn't give you probable cause to search my car. Rollins turned, his face hardening. You a lawyer trying to tell me about probable cause? I can smell alcohol coming from this vehicle. Tanya blinked rainwater from her eyes. That's not possible. I don't drink. Are you calling me a liar? Rollins stepped closer, using his height to intimidate her. Maybe you've got something to hide. Rich lady in a fancy car, driving through neighborhoods where you don't belong. A chill ran through Tanya that had nothing to do with the rain. She'd heard about Rollins during her investigation briefing. Multiple complaints of racial profiling, all mysteriously dismissed. Evidence vanishing. Witnesses changing stories. He was one of the main reasons she was undercover in Atlanta. I'm just trying to get to a dinner party, she said, softening her tone. Sometimes de-escalation was the safest route, even when you knew your rights were being violated. I'm already late. Well, you're going to be a lot later, Rollins replied, already rummaging through her glove compartment. Or maybe not going at all. Tanya watched helplessly as he searched her car, methodically going through her belongings. Her real FBI credentials were hidden in a secret compartment under the seat, standard procedure for deep cover operations. If he found those, months of investigation would be compromised. Another car passed by, this one slowing significantly. An older white woman peered out, making eye contact with Tanya before driving on. At least someone had seen her situation, even if they hadn't stopped. What's this? Rollins emerged from the car holding a small baggie with white powder. Tanya's heart sank. She knew with absolute certainty that wasn't hers. That's not mine, she said, keeping her voice steady despite her rising panic. I've never seen that before. Rollins' smile was cold. That's what they all say. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Officer, I think you should call your supervisor, Tanya suggested, trying one last approach. This is a mistake. The only mistake was you thinking you could drive around here with drugs in your car, Rollins replied, pulling handcuffs from his belt. You have the right to remain silent. As the cold metal closed around her wrists, Tanya fought to stay calm. This was escalating beyond what she anticipated, but she reminded herself that somewhere back at the FBI field office they were tracking her location. All she needed to do was play this out and collect more evidence. Evidence that was currently being recorded on her watch. Rollins guided her roughly toward his patrol car, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. Lawyers think they're so smart. Let's see how smart you feel spending the night in lockup. The ride to the police station felt endless. Tanya sat in the back of Rollins' patrol car, her hands cuffed uncomfortably behind her. The rain hammered against the roof, matching the pounding of her heart. Through the partition, she could see Rollins smirking as he radioed in. Got a lawyer type with drugs in her fancy car, he said to dispatch, emphasizing the word lawyer with obvious distaste. Bringing her in now. Tanya closed her eyes briefly, focusing on her breathing. This wasn't how her undercover operation was supposed to go, but maybe it was exactly what the investigation needed. Direct evidence of Rollins' misconduct was now being captured in real time. Still, the planted drugs complicated things considerably. The patrol car pulled into the station's back lot, and Rollins cut the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, perhaps savoring his victory. Then he got out and opened her door, the rain still coming down in sheets. "Watch your head," he said mockingly as he pulled her from the car, making no real effort to protect her from bumping against the doorframe. Her shoulder hit hard, and she winced. "Could you loosen these cuffs a bit?" Tanya asked. "They're cutting into my wrists." "Should have thought about comfort before you decided to carry drugs around Pine Hills," Rollins replied, guiding her roughly toward the station's back entrance. The bright fluorescent lights inside were jarring after the darkness of the rainy night. A few officers looked up from their desks as Rollins paraded her through the bullpen. Some quickly averted their eyes, a telling reaction that Tanya filed away mentally. They knew. They all knew what kind of cop Rollins was. "Look what I found cruising through Pine Hills," Rollins announced loudly, pushing Tanya forward. "Got herself a BMW, a fancy suit, and a baggie of what looks like cocaine." A heavy-set officer at a nearby desk raised his eyebrows. "Seriously, she doesn't look the type." "They never do, Rivera," Rollins laughed. "That's how they get away with it." Tanya remained silent, observing everything. The layout of the station, which officers seemed uncomfortable with Rollins' behavior, which ones appeared to be his allies. All valuable intelligence for the larger investigation. Rollins led her to a processing desk where a young officer sat looking tired. "Booker, Chen," Rollins ordered, handing over her driver's license. "Possession with intent to distribute." Officer Chen looked up, surprised. "Intent to distribute? How much did you find?" "Enough," Rollins said vaguely. "Run her info. I'm going to get some coffee." As Rollins walked away, Officer Chen gave Tanya an apologetic look. "I need to take your fingerprints, ma'am." "I understand," Tanya replied calmly. "You're just doing your job." Chen typed her information into the computer system. Tanya knew exactly what would happen next. Her fake identity as Tanya Wilson, attorney at Baldwin and Associates, had been carefully constructed to withstand basic scrutiny, but a deeper search would flag her file for certain high-ranking officers. "Can I make my phone call?" Tanya asked. Chen nodded. "After processing, won't be long." From across the room, Tanya noticed an older officer watching the situation with interest. The nameplate on his desk read Lieutenant Garrison. He got up and walked toward the break room where Rollins had gone. 5 minutes later, as Chen was finishing taking her fingerprints, raised voices came from the direction of the break room. The bullpen grew quieter as everyone strained to listen. "You did blow a KT." Lieutenant Garrison's voice boomed. "Without a warrant? Without probable cause?" Rollins' response was too low to hear, but the lieutenant's voice came through clearly. "Do you have any idea who she is?" Footsteps approached rapidly. Lieutenant Garrison emerged from the hallway, his face flushed with anger. Behind him, Rollins looked confused and defensive. "Remove those cuffs immediately," Garrison ordered Chen, who quickly complied. "Sir?" Chen asked, clearly puzzled. "Call Captain Rogers," Garrison said tersely. "Now. And get Special Agent Parker from the FBI field office on the phone." The room went completely silent. Every eye turned to Tanya, who rubbed her wrists where the handcuffs had left angry red marks. Roland's face had drained of all color. "Special Agent?" Tanya looked him directly in the eyes. "I believe the lieutenant has a phone call to make," she said quietly. "But you and I will definitely be continuing this conversation, Detective Rollins." Lieutenant Garrison guided Tanya into a small conference room, away from the curious eyes of the other officers. The room had a long table, a few chairs and blinds that were quickly drawn closed. Rollins followed, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Please sit down, Agent Wilson," Garrison said, pulling out a chair for her. His entire demeanor had changed, from the commanding officer who'd shouted orders to someone who looked like he might lose his job by morning. "I prefer to stand for now, Lieutenant," Tanya replied, rubbing her wrists where the handcuffs had left marks. "I believe we're waiting for Captain Rogers and my supervisor." Rollins leaned against the wall, his arms crossed defensively across his chest. "There's been some kind of mistake," he muttered. Tanya turned to face him directly. "A mistake? Is that what you call planting evidence on a driver after an illegal search of their vehicle?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Rollins shut back, but his voice lacked conviction. "That baggie was in your car." Detective Rollins, Tanya said calmly, everything from the moment you pulled me over has been recorded. She tapped her watch. FBI standard issue. Audio and video uploaded to our servers in real time. The color drained further from Rollins' face. You're bluffing. The door opened and a tall man in a rumpled suit walked in. His tie was loosened and he looked like he'd been pulled away from dinner. His badge, hanging from a chain around his neck, identified him as Captain Rogers. Agent Wilson, he said, nodding respectfully. I just got off the phone with Special Agent Parker. He's on his way. He glanced at Rollins, his expression hardening. What the hell were you thinking, Rollins? Before Rollins could answer, the door opened again. This time, a broad-shouldered black man in a perfectly tailored suit entered. Special Agent Parker had arrived much faster than anyone expected. Tony, Tanya greeted him with relief. Are you okay? Parker asked, quickly assessing her for any injuries. I'm fine, she assured him. Though Detective Rollins here was doing his best to ensure I spent the night in lockup on fabricated drug charges. Parker's expression darkened as he turned to face Rollins. Do you understand what you've done, Detective? You've interfered with a federal investigation that's been ongoing for 6 months. I didn't know she was FBI, Rollins protested weakly. And that makes your actions acceptable. Parker challenged. Profiling drivers based on their race, conducting illegal searches, planting evidence. Captain Rogers looked physically ill. Agent Parker, I want to assure you that this is not how our department operates. Actually, Captain, Tanya cut in, that's exactly why I'm here. We've received 47 complaints about this precinct in the last year alone. Patterns of racial profiling, evidence tampering, excessive force, all concentrated among a small group of officers. The room fell silent. Rollins stared at the floor. I didn't plant anything, he finally said, but his voice was hollow. Tanya reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small vial. This is what you allegedly found in my car, correct? She handed it to Parker, who examined it closely. The FBI lab will test this, Parker said. And I'm willing to bet we'll find your fingerprints inside the bag, Detective Rollins, not Agent Wilson's. This is ridiculous, Rollins sputtered. You can't just come in here and... We have a federal warrant, Parker interrupted, placing a document on the table. As of now, this precinct and all its records are part of our investigation. Captain Rogers sank into a chair. My God. Tanya watched Rollins carefully. The man who had been so intimidating on the roadside now looked small and cornered. His eyes darted around the room, perhaps looking for allies, but finding none. Detective Rollins, Captain Rogers said quietly, surrender your badge and gun. What? You can't be serious, Rollins protested. Based on her word against mine. Based on recorded evidence, Tanya corrected him. And this is just the beginning. As Rollins reluctantly placed his badge and gun on the table, the door opened again. 3 more FBI agents entered, carrying boxes and equipment. We'll need access to all personnel files, Parker informed Captain Rogers, and every complaint filed against this precinct for the past 5 years. Tanya watched as the reality of the situation finally hit Rollins, what had started as a routine traffic stop. Another opportunity to harass someone he deemed out of place had just brought down an avalanche that would bury his career and possibly send him to prison. You really should have just let me go to my dinner party, Tanya said softly. The precinct buzzed like an overturned beehive. Word spread quickly as FBI agents set up shop in the conference room, requesting files and conducting interviews with officers one by one. Detective Rollins sat alone in the break room, staring at the empty space on his belt where his gun and badge had been just an hour ago. Tanya stood by the window in Captain Rogers' office, watching the rain continue to fall outside. Her suit had finally dried, though it would need professional cleaning to remove the wrinkles. Parker sat across from Rogers, both men reviewing the preliminary evidence from Tanya's recording. This is damning, Rogers admitted, running a hand through his thinning hair. I knew Rollins was rough around the edges, but this, he shook his head. Rough around the edges? Tanya turned from the window. Captain, with all due respect, Detective Rollins has 17 complaints of racial profiling in his file. All dismissed. All buried. Rogers flinched at her words. I wasn't directly involved in those investigations. That's part of the problem, Parker said, his voice firm but not unkind. Turning a blind eye is still a choice, Captain. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Chen poked his head in, looking nervous. Captain, we've got reporters outside. Someone tipped them off about the FBI being here. Rogers sighed heavily. That didn't take long. We should make a statement, Parker suggested. Control the narrative before rumors start flying. Tanya's phone buzzed with a text message. She checked it and frowned. It's already on social media. Someone inside the station posted about my arrest and the FBI's arrival. Outside the office, raised voices could be heard. Rollins had left the break room and was confronting one of the FBI agents in the hallway. You can't just come in here and tear apart our precinct based on one incident, he shouted. Tanya stepped out of the office, Parker closed behind her. Several officers had gathered to watch the confrontation, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. This isn't about one incident, Detective, Tanya said clearly, making sure everyone could hear. This is about a pattern of behavior that has been ignored for far too long. Rollins turned to her, his anger barely contained. You set me up. You were looking for a reason to come after me. No, Detective, she replied calmly. You gave us the reason when you decided to profile me, search my car illegally, and plant evidence. I was actually investigating several officers in this precinct, and you weren't even at the top of our list. But you put yourself there tonight. A hushed silence fell over the group. Some officers looked at their shoes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Others watched with undisguised interest, perhaps relieved that someone was finally holding Rollins accountable. Officer Rivera, who had been at the desk when Rollins brought Tanya in, stepped forward. I want to speak with the FBI agents, he said firmly. There are things they should know. Rollins' head snapped toward him. Rivera, shut your mouth. No, Rivera said, standing taller. I'm done covering for you and your friends. This has gone on too long. Another officer nodded in agreement. Me too. I've seen things that weren't right. The dam was breaking. Years of silence and complicity were crumbling in real time. Parker gestured for the officers to follow him to the conference room, leaving Tanya and Rollins facing each other in the hallway. You've ruined everything, Rollins muttered, his voice barely audible. You did that yourself, Tanya replied. Every time you abuse your power. Every time you targeted someone because of their skin color. Every time you broke the law you swore to uphold. Captain Rogers emerged from his office, looking years older than he had that morning. The press is waiting, he announced. I need to make a statement. We'll join you, Parker said, returning from getting the other officers settled with his agents. As they walked toward the front of the station, Tanya felt the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop anymore. It was about a system that had protected him, about the officers who had remained silent, and about all the people whose lives had been damaged by unchecked power and prejudice. Outside, camera lights illuminated the rainy night, waiting to capture the beginning of a story that would shake the department to its core. 2 weeks had passed since the night of Tanya's arrest. The story had exploded across local news and then national headlines. FBI agent arrested by cop under investigation. The body camera footage, along with Tanya's own recording, had been released to the public after mounting pressure from community groups and civil rights organizations. Tanya sat in a booth at a small diner 3 blocks from the FBI field office, stirring her coffee as she waited. The bell above the door jingled, and Officer Chen entered, scanning the room before spotting her and walking over. Thanks for meeting me, Tanya said as Chen slid into the booth across from her. Chen looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. The precinct is a mess, he said quietly. Internal Affairs has taken over. They've suspended 4 more officers besides Rollins. The waitress came by with a second mug, pouring coffee for Chen before walking away. I heard Captain Rogers resigned, Tanya said. Chen nodded. Yesterday. He gave a statement saying he failed in his duty to properly supervise his officers. He took a sip of coffee. It's weird. The station feels lighter somehow, like we've been carrying this heavy secret for years, and now it's out in the open. That's often how it feels when corruption is exposed, Tanya replied. Have the other officers been cooperative with the investigation? Most of them, Chen said. River has been incredible. Turns out he's been keeping his own records for years, dates, names, incidents where Rollins and his friends crossed the line. He was just too scared to come forward alone. Tanya smiled slightly. That's more common than you'd think. It takes tremendous courage to stand up against a broken system, especially when you're inside it. The community meetings have been tough, Chen continued. So many people coming forward with stories about Rollins and the others, things that never made it into official complaints. The way they were treated, it's hard to listen to. Outside the diner window, people hurried past on the sidewalk. A group of protesters marched by, carrying signs demanding police reform. Their chants were muffled by the glass. The department has a long road ahead, Tanya said, watching the protesters. Rebuilding community trust won't happen overnight. Chen followed her gaze. I joined the force to help people. A lot of us did. It's painful to see how much damage has been done by a few bad officers who were protected for too long. Tanya's phone buzzed with a text from Parker. Grand jury convening tomorrow. We got the indictments. She looked up at Chen. The grand jury is meeting tomorrow. It looks like Rollins and the others will be formally charged. What happens to your investigation now? Chen asked. It expands, Tanya replied. What happened to me that night was just the tip of the iceberg. We've received over 60 calls since the story broke, people sharing similar experiences, not just with your precinct, but across the department. Chen shook his head slowly. I can't believe it took something like this to finally break through. Often does, Tanya said. Systems protect themselves until they can't anymore, until the evidence is too overwhelming to ignore. The diner door opened again, and Parker walked in, carrying a thick folder. He nodded at Chen before sliding into the booth next to Tanya. The DA just called, he said without preamble. They're charging Rollins with evidence tampering, false arrest, civil rights violations, and filing false reports. 3 other officers are facing similar charges, and they're looking at 2 former internal affairs investigators who buried complaints. Chen exhaled heavily. And Captain Rogers? Cooperating fully in exchange for immunity, Parker replied. He's providing names and incidents going back 8 years. Tanya watched Chen's face as he processed this information. What are you thinking? She asked gently. I'm thinking about all the people who were hurt, Chen said. All the people who tried to report Rollins and weren't believed. Who gave up on the system because the system failed them. He looked up at Tanya. Will any of this actually change things? Tanya considered his question carefully. Outside, the protesters' chants grew louder as more people joined them. Change rarely happens all at once, she finally said. But sometimes it needs a catalyst, a moment that makes the truth impossible to ignore. She glanced toward the window. What happens next depends on people like you, Chen. Officers who remember why they put on the badge in the first place. Parker nodded in agreement. The hard work is just beginning, he said. But at least now, it can begin. 6 months later, Tanya stood at the back of a packed community center. The walls were decorated with colorful posters made by local schoolchildren. Respect, justice, and community written in bright crayon letters. At the front of the room, Chief Williams, the newly appointed police chief, was addressing the crowd. Today marks a new beginning, she said, her voice firm and clear. We can't undo the harm that was done, but we can make sure it never happens again. Tanya scanned the faces in the audience. Some looked hopeful, others skeptical. Change never came easy, especially when trust had been so deeply broken. The trial of Detective Rollins and 3 other officers had concluded just 2 weeks earlier. All 4 were found guilty. Rollins had received the harshest sentence, 12 years for multiple counts of evidence tampering, false arrest, civil rights violations, and perjury. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of abuse spanning nearly a decade. Agent Wilson. A soft voice pulled Tanya from her thoughts. She turned to find Mrs. Powell, an elderly woman whose grandson had been wrongfully arrested by Rollins 3 years earlier. His case had been one of many reviewed and ultimately overturned following the investigation. Mrs. Powell, how are you? Tanya smiled warmly. Blessed, the older woman replied, taking Tanya's hands in hers. My grandson started college last month. That wouldn't have happened if he'd been convicted on those false charges. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. I wanted to thank you. I just did my job, Tanya said, squeezing the woman's hands gently. No, Mrs. Powell shook her head. You did what others wouldn't. You stood up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. At the front of the room, Chief Williams was outlining the department's new accountability measures: body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public, a civilian oversight board with real power, and mandatory bias training for all officers. Parker appeared at Tanya's side, offering a small note to Mrs. Powell before turning to Tanya. The director called. He wants to see you in Washington next week. About what? Tanya asked, though she already suspected the answer. They're creating a new division focused on law enforcement accountability, Parker explained quietly. They want you to head it up. The news wasn't entirely unexpected. Since her case had made national headlines, Tanya had been asked to consult with police departments across the country looking to address similar issues. Near the refreshment table, she spotted Officer Chen, now Sergeant Chen, chatting with community members. He had been promoted after the investigation, part of the department's effort to elevate officers who demonstrated integrity and a commitment to ethical policing. I haven't decided if I'm going to take it, Tanya told Parker, watching Chen interact with the community he served. Parker raised an eyebrow. Why not? It's a huge opportunity. Sometimes the most important work happens right here, at the local level, Tanya replied. In communities where people can see real change happening. The meeting concluded and people began to mingle. Chief Williams made her way through the crowd toward Tanya and Parker. Agent Wilson, she greeted them. I was hoping to catch you before you left. Our recruitment numbers are up 40% since we implemented the new policies, and applications from women and people of color have doubled. That's encouraging, Tanya said genuinely. We still have a long way to go, the chief acknowledged. But for the first time in years, I feel like we're moving in the right direction. As they talked, Tanya noticed a group of young people in the corner, watching her with undisguised awe. One of them, a young black woman around college age, seemed to be gathering her courage to approach. Excuse me, the young woman said, finally stepping forward. Are you Agent Wilson, the one from the case? Tanya nodded with a gentle smile. I'm studying criminal justice at State, the young woman explained. After your case, well, it changed how I saw things. Made me think maybe I could make a difference too. Something warm bloomed in Tanya's chest, a feeling that all the difficult days, the dangers of undercover work, the frustration of fighting against entrenched systems might actually be worth it. You absolutely can, Tanya told her with conviction. The system only changes when good people work from the inside and the outside to hold it accountable. As the young woman beamed at her, Tanya thought about the job offer waiting in Washington. There would always be more corrupt officers like Rollins, more systems that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The work was far from over. But looking around the community center, seeing real change beginning to take root, Tanya felt something she hadn't expected: hope.